I remember well the first time I heard that strange sound coming from the horizon. Back then, in 1942, the skies over Europe seemed to belong to someone. The Luftwaffe still reigned supreme. Its B-109 and FW-190 fighters patrolled the skies with the confidence of those who believed that German air superiority was unquestionable. From the English Channel to the Romanian countryside, the roar of Daimler-Benz engines was almost synonymous with power, but the war and the sky were about to change color. By that point, the German pilots had already become accustomed to the Allied bombers. They could identify one from afar, B-17 Flying Fortress. It was large, sturdy, and flew in tight formation, protecting itself from the crossfire of dozens of machine guns. The Germans respected him, and they knew how to deal with him. But when the new American giant, it started appearing on radar screens and in pilots' vision, and many thought it was a case of mistaken identity. The shape was strange, a long, almost square fuselage, and a twin tail that more closely resembled the rudder of an experimental aircraft. Its flight seemed less elegant than that of a B-17, but it was fast, too fast for its size. It was consolidated B-24 Liberator, and few, at that beginning, understood what they were seeing. In German intelligence reports, the Liberator was described as a bomber of unusual configuration, but with long-range potential. It didn't seem threatening at first glance, but what nobody knew was that plane had been designed for breakdown borders, both geographical and strategic. While the Luftwaffe struggled to contain air raids on occupied territory, the United States wanted something different. They needed a bomber capable of to reach places the B-17 couldn't. Further, for longer and with a greater explosive charge. Thus was born the B-24. With its Asa Davis, a feat of aerodynamic engineering that allowed it to fly faster and consume less fuel. In initial tests, the Liberator surprised even the engineers. It could transport up to 3,600 kilograms of bombs and still fly more than 1,000 kilometers without refueling. This meant that he could attack refineries, ports, and industrial centers far beyond the Luftwaffe's defensive lines. For the Germans, this represented a new type of threat, one that did not respect distances. The first missions with the B-24 began discreetly, in secondary theaters of operation, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and then Southern Europe. But gradually, Liberator's formations began to appear where they were least expected, in the heart of Germany. And when that happened, the Luftwaffe realized that something had changed. It wasn't just another bomber in the sky. It was a strategic war machine, a new philosophy of aerial combat. The B-24 was not designed to compete with the B-17. He came to open paths where the enemy thought the air was safe. From that moment on, every German pilot who spotted a bomber formation knew, if there were Liberators among them, the mission would be different, longer, more difficult, and almost always more deadly. I can still imagine the feeling of those days, the tension on the radios, the siren alarms at the bases, and that characteristic sound of the 4 Pratt and Whitney engines cutting through the air. It was the sound of a new era in the skies of war. I always say that the Luftwaffe was a force that exuded confidence, perhaps even too much. At the start of the war, nothing seemed capable of stopping its pilots. The skies over Europe were the playground of legendary aces like Galland, Mulders, and Marseille. They saw themselves as hunters in a heaven of easy prey, and with each victory the feeling of invincibility grew. But every hunt has an end, and sometimes it's the prey that changes the rules of the game. It was in early 1943 that the arrogance of the Luftwaffe began to show signs of wear. The war was no longer a series of quick and clean victories. Fighting in Russia was draining resources. The Allies were tightening their grip on the Mediterranean, and the Reich's air defense increasingly demanded experienced pilots who could no longer be easily replaced. And then came the B-24 Liberator. The first encounters took place over the North Sea, formations of bombers that seemed to fly endlessly, farther than the Bf-109s could follow without running out of fuel. The wiretap reports were confusing. Unknown four-engine bombers, higher than expected speed, heavy defensive armament, above-average resistance. On the radios at the German bases, the messages were repeated. Attention, new American model identified. B-24 formation en route. It was as if something new had emerged on the front lines, something that challenged the Luftwaffe's traditional tactics. Up to that point, German pilots had a very clear method of attack. Approach from the front or the sides, fire short bursts, and retreat quickly before defensive fire could reach them. With the B-24, this didn't work so well. The 50 caliber turrets covered almost all angles of attack, and their elongated silhouette made it difficult to predict the weak point. It was like attacking a flying porcupine. Furthermore, the B-24 had something that few expected: speed. It could reach speeds of 470 km/h, which in many situations made it almost unreachable for heavy interceptors like the Bf-110 or the Mi-410. Even single-engine fighters needed to precisely calculate the timing of their approach, as any error in timing left them vulnerable to fire from the 50 caliber machine guns. Mounted in the tail and sides, remember an account given by a German pilot who survived an attack against a formation of Liberators over Bremen. He said, "I fired straight at the bomber and hit its nose, but before I could maneuver, I was hit by a hail of bullets coming from behind and above. It seemed like every part of that plane had eyes and teeth. Confidence began to give way to caution, and caution in the air can be deadly." The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. It changed attack formations, used new types of ammunition, and even created specific tactics against the B-24, such as the vertical attack, diving from above at superior speed to avoid turret fire. But each adaptation took time, and time was something Germany no longer had. Meanwhile, American factories were producing Liberators at a frenetic pace, a new plane every hour. The Luftwaffe, in turn, was beginning to suffer from a shortage of fuel, pilots and spare parts. It was an uneven race, and the Germans were racing with flat tires. In the skies over France, Belgium and northern Italy, the presence of the B-24 was growing, and along with it, the perception grew that Allied air power was evolving. What was once just a threat was now becoming a tide, constant, powerful, impossible to stop. The awakening of the Luftwaffe was not a moment of glory. It was a scary moment, because for the first time, the German pilots realized that the enemy had learned and was armed with something they were not prepared to face it. There's something curious about aerial warfare. Sometimes, what's most frightening isn't the sound of machine guns, nor the flash of tracer bullets streaking across the sky. What truly causes fear is the silence that comes before the attack. When you realize the enemy has managed to get this far, that's exactly what the B-24 brought to Germany, the silence before the storm. Until 1943, Germans believed that distances were a natural barrier. The cities in the industrial heartland of the Reich, such as Ploiești, Regensburg and Schweinfurt, seemed safe. The B-17s, with all their power, simply they did not have sufficient range to reach those targets and return. It was necessary to cross hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, fly for hours under enemy fire, and still face Luftwaffe patrols. But the B-24 changed all that. With its larger fuel tanks and more efficient aerodynamics, it could flying more than 3,000 kilometers without refueling. This meant that from bases in North Africa, Italy, or England, it could reach oil refineries, aircraft factories, and logistics centers that were previously inaccessible. Suddenly, places that were considered safe began to hear the sound of Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines approaching. The Luftwaffe command was perplexed. How could these bombers cover such distances, withstand anti-aircraft defenses, and still return in formation? The answer lay in the Liberator's design itself. Its slim profile and Davis wings gave it impressive efficiency, less consumption, more range, more charge, and this combination began to change the map of the war. The B-24's long-range missions were not just attacks. They were demonstrations of force. Each flight over the heart of Germany silently proclaimed, "There is no safe place anymore." German intelligence reports record the perplexity. American bombers are appearing in regions they shouldn't be able to reach. Estimates of enemy range need to be revised. But in addition to the military impact, there was the psychological impact. German civilians began to realize that no matter where they were, the sky could become a battlefield. Air raid sirens echoed through cities that, until then, had never seen an attack. And for the Luftwaffe pilots, it was even worse. They knew that with each new interception mission, the bombers were coming from further and further away. It wasn't just a matter of defending the airspace. It was a struggle to understand how far the enemy could go. A German pilot wrote in his diary after encountering a formation of B-24s over Romania, "I thought the sky was ours, but they came from where the map ends. They came as if the whole world were their battlefield." That was the true strength of the B-24, the freedom to choose where to fight. While the B-17 was the symbol of aerial strength, the Liberator was the symbol of mobility. He could attack refineries in the east, ports in the south, and factories in the heart of Germany, all in a single week. For the Luftwaffe, it was like trying to plug all the holes in a dam with their bare hands. Each time they reinforced one front, another was hit, and each new attack seemed to come from a different direction. Distance, which had once been Germany's ally, was now becoming its enemy. The German pilots began to realize that they were fighting something they couldn't contain, and perhaps most frightening, against something that he never got tired. The American industry was producing one B-24 per hour. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots who could not be replaced. It was a battle of endurance, and this time was on the Allies' side. In the skies above the Reich, the B-24's range was not just a technical advantage. It was a warning, a reminder that the war, at last, had ceased to be local. She was now global, and in the endless skies of Europe, this change was irreversible. There are moments in history when the sky seems to be falling on the earth. One of those moments happened in August 1st, 1943, when hundreds of B-24 Liberators took off from bases in Libya, crossing the Mediterranean towards what would become one of the most audacious and bloody missions of the entire war. The target was the Romanian city of Ploiești, the beating heart of Axis oil production. The Luftwaffe knew that Ploiești was vital. The refineries there fueled panzer tanks, Messerschmitt fighter planes, and even Wehrmacht vehicles on the eastern and North African fronts. Without that oil, Hitler's mechanized empire would begin to move with difficulty, and eventually come to a standstill. I remember the first time I heard the recordings from that day. The sound was deafening, dozens of Pratt & Whitney engines roaring in unison, flying at less than 100 meters altitude in broad daylight over enemy territory. The plan was bold, perhaps too bold. To avoid German radar, the B-24s would fly at low altitude, almost scraping the wheat fields and trees. It was a mission of precision, but also of sacrifice. When the first Liberators crossed the Danube and entered Romania, Luftwaffe radars and observers sounded the alarm. Within minutes, the German fighter jets, Bf-109s and Fed W190s, were already in the air, ready to intercept. But it wasn't an ordinary interception. This time, the attack came underneath and in a straight line. American bombers advanced in waves, firing their machine guns while dropping bombs just meters from the refinery chimneys. One of the surviving pilots described it this way: "The sky was on fire. The smoke was so thick it looked like night in the middle of the day. The towers were exploding like volcanoes, and the heat was so intense that the metal of the plane seemed to melt in your hands. The Luftwaffe reacted with fury. Dozens of fighter jets dove onto the B-24s, which were already flying damaged, with engines on fire and crew members injured. But even amidst the chaos, they did not back down. It was a suicidal race to destroy the refineries, and in a way, to prove that the B-24 could do the impossible. Subsequent reports revealed the price of that boldness. 54 bombers lost, hundreds of crew members killed, missing, or captured, a devastating casualty rate. But the impact was enormous. The Ploiești refineries burned for days, oil production plummeted, and, for a brief moment, the logistical heart of the Axis stopped beating. For the Luftwaffe, that mission was a shock. They knew that Americans were stubborn, but they never imagined that they would attack Ploiești in that manner, from below, without fighter support, facing one of the heaviest anti-aircraft defenses in Europe. German commander Alfred Gerstenberg, responsible for the region's defense, described the attack as hell coming down from heaven, and indeed, it was. Even the German pilots, accustomed to seeing the fires of war, were stunned by the scene. The B-24s, even in pieces, kept advancing, some threw bombs that were already on fire. Others collided with their targets, turning into fireballs. It was a spectacle of courage and tragedy. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe's respect for the B-24 changed forever. It was not just an efficient or long-range bomber. The Liberator had shown something that no statistic could measure: resilience. It might be damaged, it might be on fire, but it kept going. And this spirit, that of accomplishing the mission no matter the cost, began to weigh on the morale of the German pilots. After Ploiești, the name Liberator took on a different meaning. It wasn't just a symbol of air power, it was a promise. The promise that the air, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, would now be contested, meter by meter, cloud by cloud. And it was there, amidst the flames and smoke of Romania, that the Luftwaffe realized the era of German air dominance was coming to an end. The B-24 was not just an enemy, the harbinger of defeat that would come from the heavens. At this point in the war, the skies over Europe were no longer owned. What was once the sovereign territory of the Luftwaffe had become a floating battlefield, chaotic, unpredictable, and increasingly dominated by the roar of American engines. B-24 Liberator. They were now appearing on all fronts, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, from Romanian refineries to Bavarian aircraft factories. It seemed as if the enemy could be anywhere. And the Luftwaffe, which used to attack, now he needed to defend himself. The change was brutal. The German pilots, accustomed to taking the initiative and hunting, became the interceptors. They no longer chose when to fight. Fight came to them at the most unexpected times, anywhere on the map. Starting in 1943, the Luftwaffe realized it needed to reinvent its tactics. And fast, new interception formations have emerged. Heavy fighter jets, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Me-410 Hornet. They were adapted to face Allied bombers head-on. They carried 20mm cannons, and in some cases, experimental 37mm and even 50mm guns, enough power to take down a B-24 with just a few shots. But there was a problem, then Umber. The B-24s didn't come alone. They came in immense formations, sometimes with more than 100 aircraft, flying in precise blocks and covered by coordinated defensive fire. It was like facing a wall of steel and flames. Luftwaffe pilots called these formations carpet and the rug. A carpet of bombers covered the sky, making it nearly impossible to cross without being hit. The fighters tried to approach in groups, diving from above or attacking in a straight line, but with each incursion, the losses increased. That's when the Germans started trying something new, the night attacks. While the sun still favored the bombers, the darkness offered a chance for balance, the night. Hunter night hunting began to gain prominence, with pilots equipped with primitive radars and searchlights. The idea was to intercept B-24 formations during night missions over the Reich, but even that proved to be a challenge. The Liberators, equipped with increasingly precise navigation systems, were able to operate in low visibility conditions with impressive efficiency. And little by little, the German night defenses found themselves overwhelmed. The night sky, which should have been the Luftwaffe's refuge, had become yet another stage for fire and destruction. I remember an excerpt from the diary of a German night fighter pilot, Hans-Werner Lerche. He wrote, "The sky no longer belongs to anyone. Sometimes I take off and I don't know if I'm hunting or fleeing. The lights I see on the horizon could be friends, enemies, or just falling debris." This sentiment sums up what the Luftwaffe was experiencing during that period. The sky was divided, not just between friends and enemies, but between hope and despair. The B-24s began operating with P-51 Mustang fighter escort, and that was the final blow. Previously, German pilots could attack bomber formations with little interference, but now the Mustangs, fast, maneuverable, and with long range, were there to hunt the hunters. What remained of the Luftwaffe elite was being eliminated day after day, mission after mission. German airfields, once symbols of power, began to resemble metal graveyards. Each morning, fewer pilots returned, and those who returned carried in their eyes the same look of those who knew that the war was tilting to the other side. The sky was divided. No longer was it a matter of who flew and who fell, but of who still believed and who already knew the war was lost. The B-24s had transformed the airspace into a field of absolute attrition. They didn't just attack strategic targets, they attacked morale. And that, in the end, was what most destroyed the Luftwaffe. There is an aspect of war that rarely appears in reports or in the pages of books. The maps show arrows, the statistics show victories, but the sky holds ghosts, and the B-24 Liberators left many of them behind. When one speaks of the Liberator, it is easy to recall its magnificent engineering, impressive range, the power of its Pratt & Whitney engines, or its ability to carry more bombs than any other bomber of its time. But inside that metal fuselage were men, young, tired, and aware that each mission could be their last. The B-24 crew knew they were fighting against the best air force the world had ever seen. The Luftwaffe may be in decline, but it was still deadly, and every flight over Europe meant crossing a corridor of fire, where the sky became a trap. The formations would depart early in the morning, while the sun was still rising over the bases of England or Italy. From up there, the crew could see the golden reflection of the sunrise on the plane's wings, and they knew they might never see that glow again. With each new mission, the probability of returning decreased. The statistics were brutal. For much of the war, American bomber crews had more than a 30% chance of not returning, and yet they went day after day without hesitation. The B-24, however advanced it was, had its weaknesses. Its design, with thin wings and a central fuel tank, made it vulnerable to fire when hit. A single well-placed shot could turn the plane into a torch. And that's why, among the pilots themselves, he earned dark nicknames: the Flying Coffin. The Flying Coffin. But even so, nobody gave up. Each successful mission meant one less refinery for the enemy, one less supply line cut, one less factory paralyzed. And this, little by little, began to weaken the heart of the German war machine. The Luftwaffe no longer had enough fuel, nor experienced pilots. What was once an offensive force was becoming defensive, exhausted, fragmented. And it was precisely that sacrifice of the B-24 crew that made this possible. While P-51 Mustang fighters provided cover, The Liberators crisscrossed the skies carrying tons of explosives and also tons of fear. They knew they were making history, but few had the time or energy to think about it. An American veteran said years later, "Up there, time didn't exist. Only the sound of engines, the smell of burnt oil, and the cold cutting into the face. When a B-24 exploded nearby, nobody cried. We would just close our eyes for a second and keep flying." That was the reality. Victory came at a price, high, merciless, human. The Luftwaffe's losses were enormous, but the cost to the Allies was also devastating. Each bombing mission required hundreds of planes and thousands of men. Even with all the industrial power of America, no factory could replace the life of a single pilot. The sky, which had once been a symbol of bravery and heroism, had become a silent graveyard, and the cities below, which were once targets, now became witnesses to mutual suffering. Because, in the end, from both sides, they were young people fighting against young people, all trapped in a cycle of destruction that none of them had created. But despite everything, the sacrifice was not in vain. Each mission, each loss, each return with a damaged aircraft represented more than just a military victory. It represented humanity's resistance against tyranny. The B-24 Liberator, despite its reputation for being difficult, dangerous, and troublesome, ended up becoming a symbol of persistence. He wasn't perfect. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. And more than that, it was the instrument of a generation that believed freedom was worth the risk, and so it was. Amidst the smoke, the fear, and the steel, that the price of victory began to be paid in the skies over Germany, over Romania, over France, paid for in courage, sweat, and blood, and forever etched in the distant sound of 4 engines that never stopped roaring. At first, the Luftwaffe seemed eternal. Their lightning victories in the skies over Poland, France, and even Russia seemed to confirm the myth of German supremacy. But as the war progressed, the roar of the Messerschmitt engines began to sound fainter, and the thunder of the B-24 Liberators, he took his place. By 1944, the air war over Europe had turned into a nightmare for Germany. The sky, once a symbol of pride and dominion, was now a field of constant fire. Allied bombers were flying day and night, attacking factories, refineries, railroads, and even entire cities. Nothing was out of reach anymore. The B-24s, with their impressive range, became the long arm of Allied vengeance. They destroyed the supply routes that kept the Luftwaffe alive. Without fuel, the German fighter planes were stuck at their bases. Without spare parts, many planes never flew again. And what remained of the experienced pilots was disappearing. The veterans had been lost on previous missions, and now the skies were occupied by inexperienced youngsters, some under 20 years old, hurriedly sent to pilot increasingly scarce aircraft. They knew they were being sent to be slaughtered. There are records of German pilots taking off with only half an hour of fuel, hoping to intercept a formation of B-24s and return by gliding. Others took off without radios, without instruments, or with only 2 functional cannons. The Luftwaffe's pride, that almost scientific precision of the early stages of the war, had been transformed into improvised despair. And the skies, once blue and orderly, have become grey and chaotic. The roar of the Liberators echoed constantly, reminding the German population that the war was lost long before the Allied troops crossed the Rhine. The underground factories were attempting to produce Hitler's new technological marvel, the Me-262 jet fighter. But the B-24 left nothing alone. Their systematic bombing missions destroyed roads, railway lines, and fuel depots. The jets could barely take off. The Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon, never had a real chance of changing the course of the war. Allied reports from that time describe a scene that is almost unrecognizable. German airfields are abandoned, planes burned, hangars destroyed. The enemy has lost the sky, and so slowly the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a fighting force. She was still fighting, yes, but she was fighting without direction and without purpose. Their pilots no longer flew to win. They flew to survive. Meanwhile, the B-24s continued to fly over Europe with almost mechanical precision. Mission after mission, the Liberator cemented its reputation as the hammer that crushed the wings of the Reich. And, in an almost poetic way, the name Liberator was beginning to be literally fulfilled, because each attack paved the way for the liberation of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately Germany itself. By 1945, the Nazi air empire had completely collapsed. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to freedom. And when the Allied bombers flew over Berlin for the last time, there were no more German interceptors to receive them. Just silence, silence and smoke. The narrator takes a deep breath. The sound of the engines gradually fades until it disappears. And for a moment, the sky returns to being just what it always was, an empty, free space without flags. But for those who lived through it, they would never be the same again. Because the end of the Luftwaffe was not just the end of an air force. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of another, an era in which war would become technological, distant, but still profoundly human. And it all began with that unmistakable sound, the sound of the 4 engines of a B-24 Liberator crossing the horizon towards the unknown. When the last engine of the B-24 was shut down and the echo of the bombings faded into the distance, the world looked to the sky with a mixture of relief and longing. The noise that for years meant destruction now meant silence, peace, and remembrance. The consolidated B-24 Liberator wasn't the most beautiful plane of the war, nor the most beloved by its crew, but it was, without a doubt, one of the most important. He represented everything that defined World War II, the union of technology, strategy, and human sacrifice. More than 18,000 units were produced, the largest number of any bomber in history. They crossed skies over Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, Italy, and even Asia. They served on all fronts, in all conditions, carrying more than just bombs. They carried the weight of freedom. Each B-24 that took off was a gigantic machine, powered by men and women who believed that freedom was worth the risk, and it was this conviction that, little by little, transformed the course of the war. When the Luftwaffe finally collapsed, the sound of the Liberators still echoed, not as the sound of destruction, but as the announcement of a new world. A world that had learned through much blood and sweat the cost of peace. Today, few B-24s still exist. Some have been restored, others are in museums, and a few still fly. Old, slow, but full of stories. Those lucky enough to hear them on the air describe the sensation as indescribable, a deep, constant roar that seems to carry the voices of all who have ever piloted it. These planes are not just metal relics, they are floating witnesses to human courage. And every rivet, every bullet hole, every scratch on the paint is a silent reminder that freedom has a price, and that it has often been paid by those who never returned home. The legacy of the B-24 isn't just in museums. It lies in the very idea of resistance, in the belief that the strength of a nation is not measured solely by its weapons, but by the determination of its people. He was, above all, the symbol of a promise. As long as there is courage, there will be freedom. And that's what makes the study of World War II so vital, because when we look back, we understand that we are not just revisiting battles, we are revisiting choices. Choices made by ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances. The B-24 Liberator was one of those choices, and no matter how much time passes, its sound still echoes like a living reminder of the skies that changed the destiny of humanity. If you enjoyed this journey through the skies of World War II and Want to continue exploring the stories behind the machines, the pilots, and the battles that shaped the world? Subscribe to the channel here. WW2 Pilots. Turn on notifications and leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and continue bringing you real stories full of emotion and authenticity. In the next episode, we'll descend from the heavens and land in a very different territory. You'll find out, like farms and ranches during World War II, they became an essential part of the war effort. While the pilots fought in the skies, another battle was raging here on Earth, silent but decisive. Get ready, because the next story will show that even far from the front lines, war has never ceased to be present. I am narrator's or channel's name, and this was another episode of WW2 Pilots, where the past gains a voice and history takes flight.